go live, and then we'll get started. Thank you all for coming. All right, and we are live. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's LGBTQ plus Youth Voices Town Hall. Thank you so much to all of you for coming, and a special thank you to Erica Fuentes and Sarah Love for joining us from Representative Jamie Raskin's office. Thank you for being here. My name is Sophia Driscoll, and I'm an AmeriCorps member with Every Mind's Community Education and Serving Together departments. I just graduated from George Mason University this past May, go Patriots, and I did a lot of work studying the relationships between religious communities and mental health professionals. And I'm also a member of the LGBTQ plus community myself, and my experience with getting to know myself and coming out informs my desire to create spaces for LGBTQ plus young people to put voice to their needs and spaces for their support people to listen, learn, and ask questions without being judged. So I'll be your moderator tonight, and I'm really excited to be here. This event is the third of our series of town hall events focusing on LGBTQ plus youth mental health in our community. And tonight we're here to listen to our panel of 3 young people and 1 parent who will speak up about how families, teachers, and community members more generally can show support to LGBTQ plus youth in the various contexts where they are in their lives. So we're going to begin by allowing each member of the panel to introduce themselves, and then we're going to jump right into the Q&A session. To submit questions, please use the Q&A function in your Zoom webinar room. Unfortunately, we will only be able to see questions that come in via the Zoom Q&A function, so please don't submit them any other way, including via the Zoom chat. So while the Zoom chat isn't available for questions, the function is open for general use. And we do ask that you remain respectful and not hostile in your dialogue there. After tonight's town hall, we will email out an LGBTQ plus youth specific resource sheet to all of the registered attendees. So do be sure to stay on the lookout for that. If you're attending another way, not on Zoom, or did not register to attend, you can find more information about EveryMind or contact us at our website, www.everymind.org. So with all of that in mind, we are going to get started with introducing the panel. So Liliana, would you like to go first, and then we will go through?
Yeah, so my name is Liliana Katz-Hollander, and I am a sophomore at Richard Montgomery High School. I'm involved in a lot of different types of advocacy, especially women's equality and feminism and environmental justice. And obviously I'm a part of the LGBTQ community. I identify as queer and I use she, her pronouns. And I'm really passionate about making sure that we as LGBTQ youth have spaces and are able to just spread advocacy.
Great. Thank you, Liliana. Cedar, would you like to go next?
Hi, I'm Cedar Dwyer. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm a junior at Richard Montgomery High School. I am the president of Montgomery County's county-wide student-led queer advocacy organization, MoCo Pride Youth. And I have been involved in student advocacy, especially LGBTQ advocacy, since I was in 8th grade. I'm a very active member of the community. I myself am part of the community. And I'm very involved with other advocacy relating to curriculum content and like other fields.
Great. Thanks, Cedar. Excited to hear from you. Daniela, want to go next?
Sure. So, hi everyone. My name is Daniela Guevara. I am a senior at Albert Einstein High School. I'm involved, as Cedar said as well, Mocha Pride Youth. This year, I'm the vice president, and I've been involved in Mocha Pride Youth for the past 3 years. A little bit about myself outside of my advocacy. I run cross country, and I use she/they pronouns, and I identify with community as queer. And I'm really excited for tonight's panel.
Great. Thanks, Daniela. And Rachel, you want to tell us a bit about yourself too?
Sure. Good evening. Thanks so much for the invitation to be here. My name is Rachel Cornwell. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a parent of 3 MCPS students, one of whom identifies as trans. And I am also a United Methodist pastor, and I'm really passionate about creating safe space for LGBTQ youth, especially in religious settings, but everywhere. And I am the author of a book that's coming out in January called Daring Adventures, Helping Gender Diverse Kids and Their Families Thrive. So I really look forward to tonight's conversation, and I'm really honored to be part of this panel.
Great. Thank you, Rachel. So from there, we are going to head right into some questions. And audience members, as you have questions, as you come up with them, please use the Q&A feature to submit them. And we will do our best to get to as many as we can in our discussion tonight. But we're going to start out with a few. So my first question, and I'm going to leave this open for anyone to grab. In your coming out process, if that's a part of your journey, what was the best thing that someone could say to you?
If I can jump in, I would say that initially the best thing that anyone could do is just listen and not offer any comments or any advice at that first moment. I think that a lot of people's first reaction is often to very enthusiastically be like, I support you, I understand. But a lot of the time, coming out is a very vulnerable thing to do. And I think that offering a listening ear is actually the best thing that anyone did for me.
I completely agree. I think that everyone's coming out process looks very different. And the way that I like to explain it is kind of like matching the energy. I know like when I came out to like some friends, I obviously wanted to feel heard, but I didn't want to feel necessarily like congratulated, if that makes sense. And I think that sometimes, just like Cedar said, that might look as very like enthusiastic and like, I'm so proud of you and I support you. And I think that that is very important. But again, I think just listening is really important as well. I know for me, at least, also sometimes coming out, you might get hit with a lot of questions or like, oh, how did you know? Or like, oh, how do you identify? And I feel like for me, at least coming out, it was just really nice to have people listen and not necessarily question.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think that especially with everyone has different experiences with coming out, and especially with it really depends when you're coming out on who you're coming out to, because for me it was completely different experiences between, you know, my parents or my friends and my old friends and my new friends. I think that I will say one thing that I don't think is considered a lot. When I came out, especially to my friends, there were a lot of them who said things like, oh, I knew it, or, oh, I told you so. And that was something that I like, they found kind of funny, like, oh, like, you know, it was obvious to me, it wasn't obvious to you. But I feel like things like that can be a little bit hurtful because we all have our own journey of figuring out what our identity is. And I feel like the biggest part of reacting to someone coming out is just like, yes, listening, and also just making sure that they know that you'll support them no matter what, whether later on they change their label or how they identify. And I think that that would have been really helpful to me when I was coming out, just people saying like, oh, that's really great that you've found something that you identify with, and I'm always here to support you no matter what.
Great. Thank you all for sharing those perspectives and different journeys and on that question. So I really appreciate it. Our next question that we have here is, how should I respond if someone tells a homophobic or transphobic or otherwise unsettling joke for the LGBTQ plus community?
I'd like to talk about this because I've actually had a lot of experiences. So I go to, a public high school in Montgomery County, which is like a pretty liberal place. There are a lot of people, especially at my school, who identify as LGBTQ plus. And I think that, but last year, but you still hear like a lot of these jokes. And the first time I heard one was, I think, just last year in the hallway. And it was someone saying, a slur, and it just, I just was filled with so much shock. And I just didn't know what to do. And I feel like as youth, it can be really difficult to address these things because, yes, there are things like that, which are, a lot of people know like are things you can't say, but there's also, the classic teenage boys calling each other gay or saying that's so gay as a negative thing. And it can just, most of the time, it feels so difficult to address that because that it's just so societally ingrained. So I think that as adults should always be the ones that try to address that, because although of course we as youth should take steps to address that, it can be really difficult, especially if it's friends or people that we interact with daily. So I think it's just really important that if adults see or hear something like that, especially teachers and educators, that they do something, they take a moment to say, hey, I want to explain to you why that's not okay.
Right. And I think also sometimes being youth, especially again, like going to a public high school, sometimes, I've overheard things, of course, but I knew sometimes maybe standing up, I'm putting myself in a situation where I'm potentially outing myself, and I think that's important to consider as well, because there's been so many situations where, of course, I would love to say something and call something out, but as, being a student and a peer, I can understand why, sometimes I would just not say anything, not because, of course, I didn't want to, but because I felt unsafe to do so. And I think that's where sometimes having a teacher there to say something is very important. I also think what's important is calling out, for like what it is. I've heard so many people maybe say something and someone might be like, oh, don't say that. But you should be specific. This is why you shouldn't say that, because what you're saying is either homophobic, transphobic, or whatever it is. But calling it out to the certain extent that you're also educating the person and knowing that that person understands why they shouldn't say the thing that they said. So that's how I feel about that question.
Yeah, Daniela voiced my own thoughts really well. When you are yourself a young queer person who is on relatively even social standing with the person that you heard make a joke or make some offensive comment, the first thing that you have to consider is, am I safe to address this? Because you can face a lot of repercussions if you out yourself or if you expose yourself in the wrong situation. And the same a lot of the time is not true if you are a caregiver, a parent, a teacher, if you are an adult in a situation. So it's really important to think about your place, especially if you have a place of power in a situation, and how you can use that to address when someone says something offensive, because just because no one else steps in doesn't mean that it doesn't have to be addressed.
Yeah, and I just wanted to lift up the idea of calling people in rather than calling them out. If you're an ally and you have an opportunity to do that, because I think just because if we identify something right off the bat as offensive and homophobic, and we say to someone, you're being offensive and homophobic, that can shut them down. But to say to them, you know, what you said is hurtful, and can I talk to you about why that's hurtful? Could I hear more about why you think that's funny? And inviting them into a conversation, especially if they're a little more mature. Maybe, I don't know if this works with high school students, but my son and I were talking a lot. He's younger and in middle school. And so he's starting to hear a lot of this homophobic and transphobic comments from his peers. And so we talked about the fact that it's not his job necessarily to engage on this, but that his friends who are allies might be able to do that, and to say something when he doesn't feel like he can.
Great, thank you. And this next question actually kind of flows into this conversation quite well. And this is, how do I support the LGBTQ plus community and people in my life without my own sexual orientation being called into question?
It's a really common reaction, I think, from people to say, oh, why are you so defensive about this? Why do you care so much? Are you gay? But I will say that I think personally that has decreased. And I also think that there's no problem with making it clear as you are defending someone or as you are pointing out why something is not okay to say. There's no problem in saying, you know, this doesn't affect me, but hey, this isn't a good thing to say. Like, hey, this isn't something that you can really make a joke about. It's not a problem to feel secure or point out your own identity, even if that identity is at odds or just not a part of what you're talking about, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I'll add a little bit of perspective on this one too, honestly, that kind of, I agree that I've seen that that reaction decrease. But when it happens, the only way to kind of counteract the idea that something has to affect us personally in our own identity for it to matter to us is to say exactly that this doesn't have to affect me personally for me to feel passionate about it. And as more and more people say that, then that becomes more of a standard response and more of a standard belief. So that's kind of my own perspective on that one. Does anyone else want to add to it?
I will say that this question kind of confused me at first, I guess, because just like from my perspective, it's like it's kind of just like I don't really understand how like my like sexual orientation would influence other people's, but I think I understand it better now. And I think that honestly, we just have to think about, you know, different sexual orientations just like we would think of any other differences. Like all you're doing when you're supporting the LGBTQ community is saying that, you know, these people just deserve the same chances and opportunities as the rest of us. And I think that can be easy to forget with all of like the controversy and news surrounding different parts of the LGBTQ community, but that's really all it is.
Thank you. Yeah. Our next question is, you know, how can you handle it or support it when a child makes statements about their sexuality or gender identity at an early age, and like kind of kindergarten, first grade, you know, how do you handle that situation? What would that support look like?
I'm really sorry. I was reading the question that was in the chat and I wasn't listening. Would you mind repeating the question?
Oh, absolutely. So the question is how to handle it when a child expresses their like make statements about their sexuality or their gender identity at a really early age, like kindergarten, first grade level. What does that look like?
I can speak to that if you'd like. My child started exploring their gender identity in preschool and changed his pronouns in first grade. I mean, it's still a journey, right? And I think, you know, at the time he didn't even really have language for what he was feeling about himself, but he knew that that he didn't belong in a female body. And actually the way he told me that was, I asked him if he was sad that he was born a girl. And he said, I told God when I was a star in the sky that I was a boy, but God made me a girl. And now I just have to live with it. And I said, I took a deep breath and I said, did you know that there are boys that were born girls and girls that were born boys? And those people are called transgender. And maybe that's what you are. And so that gave him some language for a possibility of his future. And it wasn't, I didn't see that as leading him or locking him into that identity, but just giving him an idea that there were options out there for who he might become. And so I think just helping your kid to feel comfortable in who they are, giving them language, giving them different ideas about different people in the world and how they identify. You're just giving them tools, right? And giving them possibilities. And you can't make your child LGBTQ. They are or they aren't. And so being a supportive parent, just like anything else, is helping your kid to know that the world is big and beautiful and diverse, and there's lots and lots of paths for them. And I think just listening to them, supporting them, knowing that it's a process, and they are developing and they're discovering who they are in so many ways, and being open to changing. You know, we sort of 3 years in, we changed pronouns and names, and we were very settled in this new identity. And we were seeing someone at the gender clinic at Children's Hospital a therapist who said to my child, if you ever feel like you're a girl, you can identify as a girl, right? And I was, what? We've made all of these changes and we're in this new place. And she said to me, but he's still very young and he has lots of growing to do, and he's going to discover who he is in so many ways. And so your job as a parent is to stay flexible and open and supportive. And so that's what I've tried to do. And so far he's been consistent about who he is and clear. But things can change, and I'm trying to stay open to the full range of possibilities. And I'm going to just say, as a parent, I know that it's hard because you have ideas for who your child is going to be, who you want them to be, what you want their life to look like. And this may not be the thing you imagined. And that's okay. You can have your own grieving and your own, find your own support group, but do everything you can to love and support your kid.
I actually want to add on to that as a perspective of maybe student. I started questioning my sexuality at a very young age, like kindergarten, pre-K. And my parents speak Spanish, and I didn't have language. I didn't know what I was feeling. I knew something was going on, but I didn't know how to express it. I didn't know that there was a community. I didn't know any of that because, again, I didn't have those tools. I didn't have language, but I was instead always very anxious because I knew something was going on. I knew I didn't fit in this bubble. I knew something was going on, but I didn't know what it was. And I just want to say that, being very young. And, I still vividly remember those feelings. It was like, if I could explain, like maybe like very just anxious because, I felt like something was wrong with me because, again, like I didn't know a community existed. I didn't know those words existed, let alone in Spanish existed. And what I wished I had was exactly that, language, and to know that there is community if you want it. If you want, there is a community. But to also know that, again, like it is flexible. And to have just someone listen and not necessarily be like, but you're so young. Because I was really young, but I look back at it now and I knew exactly what I was experiencing, and I knew it there, and I knew it like when I was 5. So just to have, again, that language is so important, and to know that you have, a community is really important, especially when you're not aware at a very young age.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'd like to build on that importance of language because I had a really different experience. I didn't have I grew up in a house that spoke a mixture of English and Spanish, and I didn't have the language or really the concept in either language to express how I felt, to express my identity. And I didn't acquire that like awareness until I was much older. The first time I came out as anything was in 6th grade, and that's no longer something I identify with. The identity I came out as in 6th grade is no longer like me. But the fact that it took so long for me to be able to explore is something that I don't think would be true if I were growing up or if I were still very young right now, because times have changed a lot, even in the past 10 years since I was 7. And there's a lot more accessibility to language. There are very different norms. So understand that as the times change, it's going to get easier and easier for your kids to understand themselves, for your kids to experiment, and that's really not a bad thing, because at the end of the day, all that creates is another sense of comfort for your child to feel like they're able to live as who they are. And I really wish I'd had that chance when I was young. So I think about how lucky your kids are to have the chance to experiment and have the chance to put words to it, and keep that in mind. Even if your first reaction is surprise, is shock, it's a good thing.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I didn't know anything about my identity until I was 20. So these things have, lots of diversity in terms of when people start asking these questions, when people are kind of forced into asking these questions by being uncomfortable with not having the answer. And, just like I think that that's true of people in the LGBTQ community and not, that we tend to ask these questions at much different ages. And so keeping that in mind as well, that, regardless of the answer that someone is coming to, these questions are asked at all different ages. Would anyone else like to add to that question before we have kind of a follow-up here? All right. So this question kind of flows right in. So a few minutes ago, you mentioned that for parents, it's important to have them just listen, and that asking why or how do you know is not helpful. I can appreciate that, but at the same time, for parents of middle or high schoolers who have never expressed any identification as trans, or I'm going to expand the question to any kind of LGBTQ identity, who all of a sudden identify this way, parents do have questions. How can we ask those questions or understand where this new identity is coming from without upsetting our child? Is there a way for parents to ask that is okay?
I can talk about this. So personally, when I came out to my parents at 2 very different times. It was, I think, at least like a year and a half apart. Not because I necessarily was afraid of a certain reaction, but just because I felt I wasn't at the point in my experience to to come out to my dad just because we have a different relationship. But I think that, and they both, my dad just kind of sat there. He was like, okay. But my mom, she did ask me a couple questions, and that was okay with me because it wasn't like she was interrogating me. She was genuinely curious. And I could tell that she wasn't asking because she was like, she had a problem with it, or because she like, or just out of like her own interest. It was out of just like not concern, but it was just out of the fact that she's my mom and she wants to know what's going on in my life. So I think it's really thinking about the line between, am I asking this for me or am I asking this for them? Because there's a very big difference between the two.
I think there's also a couple really important things to keep in mind when you're trying to figure out the best way to ask these questions. The first is that although this isn't, something that any parent is going to like to hear, it's very possible that your kid has been exploring this identity, has been, identifying this way for longer than they've expressed it to you. A lot of kids feel more comfortable coming out at school to friends, etc., before they do at home. And that's not to say that you did anything wrong. It's just that, it's often very difficult to breach these topics with your family. So that's one thing that it's important to remember. But another thing is just that when asking these questions, there's no harm in asking, how'd you figure this out? And asking what produced this like realization. The harm only comes when you are asking it with the intention to make them wait, to make them realize that, no, I'm wrong, because no amount of questioning is going to do that. And what it will do is create discomfort and it can really hurt. So there's nothing wrong with asking, just to make sure you are, like Liliana said, asking for them and not for you or for some other motive.
Thank you. Another question we have is, and I'm gonna punt this one to Rachel first because it does have to do with the church community. How can my community and church give more support and belonging to LGBTQ IA plus youth and young adults?
So there's a range of acceptance in religious communities. You have outright churches especially, but also other religious groups that condemn LGBTQ identity. And then there are some that just don't talk about it at all, or that are tolerant and have a don't ask, don't tell kind of culture. And then there are places that are more accepting and affirming. So there's a spectrum of experiences. And if your faith community is starting to embrace LGBTQ people and wanting to be more accepting and affirming, I would look at the language that you use and the policies that you have in place, especially around youth group, and assumptions that you make, like simple things like, on your Sunday school registration form, do you have parent or do you have mother, father? Do you have a gender neutral bathroom in your space, or a space that is that feels safe for anybody to use? When you talk about tell stories in your homily, do you talk about people with a wide variety of life experiences? Do you hear that? Do you hear those affirming things being spoken aloud in the worship service? There's a lot of ways that and the other thing I would say is that some faith communities want to just put a rainbow flag on the outside and say we're a welcoming place, but haven't done the work internally. And that's really dangerous. when you haven't actually had conversations in the community about what does it mean to affirm, what does it mean to accept and celebrate, and helping people work through their assumptions, their questions before you throw open the doors and say everyone is welcome here. I would say do the work to make sure that you really are a welcoming space, and a safe space for everyone. Yeah.
Thank you, Rachel. Does anyone else want to add to that question of churches, community spaces? How can they be more accepting and open and provide that support?
I can say really briefly, I'm Jewish, so me and my family belong to a temple, and I think that they've really done an amazing job in that I've never felt that my identity was at odds with my religion. I wouldn't say I'm particularly religious, but I've never felt that there's something like I said, I've never felt like it's been at odds. I feel like my temple does a really great job of just making sure everyone, including kids, know that it's a place of acceptance and tolerance. They also do a lot of social justice work, some of which does regard LGBTQ rights. So I think just like as Ms. Cornwell said, just taking those extra steps to ensure like not just tolerance, but like acceptance and support.
Great, thank you. My next question I have is, how can I support individuals who identify as asexual or do not feel like they're part of the LGBTQ community because others don't understand how they identify or how they choose to label?
There's a really wide variation in, how different people choose to relate their own identity and their own experiences to that of the community at large. So, someone doesn't have to identify as a member of the community for their identity to be something that you can support. The same responses of, oh, thank you for telling me. I'm glad you felt comfortable to share that with me. I'm here if you ever want to talk about anything. I'm here if I support you. It goes either way. Someone doesn't have to expressly tell you, I am queer, I am LGBTQ, for you to be able to tell them, I understand, I support you, I love you no matter what.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'll also add on to this one in that I think asexuality specifically, this happens that sometimes, someone can be asexual and be in a relationship, and then others will get confused, and then, they'll feel invalidated in like their own identity process, because then when they say they're asexual, they may like get responses of confusion. And this kind of goes with a lot of the other things that we've said tonight, that, asking these clarifying questions without kind of trying to poke holes in their argument for their identity. Because it is possible to identify as asexual and, be in a relationship. It's a possibility to identify as asexual and another, and where kind of other labels are not as someone pleases and as someone views themselves. So kind of allowing them to come into their own identity and use their own internal compass to trust where they fall can be really helpful. And again, those kind of guiding questions. Anyone else like to add to that one? All right. The next question I have is a lot more general. So when you enter a new place, what puts you at ease and lets you know that you're welcome to be your true self?
I will say most of my experiences with things like this are in classrooms, and you see it a lot, but I'd say like they're really small things. Like a lot of teachers around my school have just little like pride flags in their like the windows to their classrooms, or things that say like, this is a safe space. I think things like that, it's pretty common now for teachers to share pronouns too. And I think that that's just a really great, small, easy thing for them to do. And another thing that I think is less acknowledged regarding classroom spaces is showing like representation. You notice that especially in like English and history classes. I feel like in recent years, I've definitely started to notice more of that, but there's a long way it can go in terms of LGBTQ representation. But I think like obviously school is like such a big part of our lives as youth, and it matters a lot. So
I also think, like for me at least, having the teachers who I know like try to build a connection with their students, outside of just teaching is very important. Like I personally know that my best relationships, or the places where I feel the most safe, are usually the teachers that I've seen make an effort to really get to know their students. Whether that's as simply as maybe, right when you start school, usually teachers might like have a Google form, like, oh, get to know you. And like they have the ability to put, oh, like your pronouns, like what do you feel safe of me like referring to you as in front of the classroom, outside the classroom, and so on. And just certain steps that teachers have taken, such as a Google form to get to know their students better, has made me feel safe, because of course there are some teachers who have like, oh, this is a safe place, or safe or like maybe have like a rainbow sticker somewhere. But again, I think forming that connection with your students deeper than just teaching is really important.
Yeah. And outside of the classroom, because I think a lot of the people here tonight are parents or caregivers rather than teachers, share your pronouns when you enter a space, even if you are cis, that means you are not a trans person. If you have like a flag or something and you're comfortable putting that up, that can help. Don't shy away from showing your kids media that has like representation. It doesn't have to be media about the queer experience, but movies that happen to have two gay people like as some of the leads. Like you don't have to actively bring it up for it to be communicated that you are a supportive person, but you can't shy away from it. You can't, hide from the topic, or it does seem like you are avoiding it.
Just to add on to what Cedar was saying, regarding like, sharing your pronouns and like asking people what their pronouns are when you first meet. I know that like for parents, that can be really hard to like change your habits. It's really hard for me as well. I feel like sometimes like asking people for pronouns, it's just like not what's expected, especially in some like teenage environments. But it's just like I feel so much more comfortable when people ask me for my pronouns, even though I do use she, her pronouns, which is what a lot of people would assume. It just lets me know that, this person's ready to like not like box me in or put me in a binary. And it just it really creates just a whole different environment and feeling of safety. And like I said, it can be really hard, but just remember that especially youth will not judge you for sharing your pronouns or asking for theirs. It's not something you have to be scared to do. And also just regarding Cedar's point of representation, it's so important. My parents never like made a point of like showing like saying, you know, this is, you know, a queer couple, or this is what, you know, LGBTQ is, but they never ever made any attempts to hide or shy away from it. And it just made it so much easier for me to like accept that it was normal. And I've talked to friends whose parents didn't do that, and it's so much harder for them to find out their identity, whatever it is. So yeah.
I guess I can talk on like the parents who didn't do that. So yeah, again, like representation really matters. I can't emphasize that enough. My experience, I guess it's quite different because, like I said, I didn't have the language, I didn't have representation. I really only started to get to know more about it maybe when I was already like 7 years into questioning. And you know, again, I wish I had a lot more representation and a lot more just normalizing it, you know, just to, even if it's like a subtle thing, like watching a movie, like Cedar said. I just think that not having it normalized made me have such a difficult, like more difficult process of feeling okay with how I identified.
And I wanted to say that there's a GSA at my kid's school, and he doesn't participate because he's not really out at school, but just knowing that that is there, that there's a group of people that are his people, I don't know, it makes me feel really a lot more comfortable about the school. And I think it makes him feel comfortable just to know that those safe spaces are there within a larger community. So I'm just really happy that there are teachers that are willing to do that, and that the PTSA sponsors that. So if your kid's school doesn't have a GSA, you might want to think about advocating for that.
Great, thank you. This next question is, what are the most positive aspects of social media for LGBTQ youth? And have any of you found support or community through social media?
The first community I found when I was trying to come out was definitely through social media. Both because I came out in middle school. I didn't have a lot of like friends in middle school, to be honest. So I, just didn't have that social outlet in school. But also just because it's a lot easier to find a community of people similar to yourself when it's on the entire internet, as opposed to just within your school. And, this is hammered in whenever anyone talks about the internet, but you do need to realize that there can be very harmful effects to, being on the internet at a young age, as well as benefits. But yeah, I would say that being able to reach out and find other people who identify the same ways that I do helped me feel a lot less shame in my identity when I was younger. Which is something that I struggled with a lot when I first came out.
I actually have a little anecdote to share about that. So I personally, in middle school, my group of friends, pretty much all of them identified in some way as members of the LGBTQ community, and they all came out and realized their identity before I did. For me, it happened in about, I'd say late 8th grade, and most of them had already come out in 6th, 7th, maybe the beginning of 8th grade. And when I first got Instagram, I don't know if everyone watching knows this, but it has a feature very similar to TikTok where you can just scroll and watch videos. And it was trying to figure out my algorithm, and it showed me a couple, sorry, I promise the story has a point. And it showed me a couple of videos related to the LGBTQ community. And at this point, I still fully thought I was straight. But I was like, oh my God, my friend would love these. I'm going to send them to her. on Instagram. And what happens when you send videos to people on Instagram is you keep getting more of those same videos. So, but then I kept sending them to her because I was like, oh my God, she'd love these videos. So within a couple weeks, just my entire feed was just filled with videos relating to the LGBTQ community. And there were a couple of them watching them. I was like, huh, I actually really relate to these. And I feel like Cedar said, there's such a wide range of ways that people experience, their identities and their sexual orientations. And I feel like the internet and just being able to see other people's experiences, it really makes you more open-minded about your own identity. Because I felt very boxed in middle school because my friends were telling me, maybe I am a part of the LGBTQ community, but there were other people saying, no, like you're straight. And I feel like the internet, like it really gave me like more of like a vocabulary and an understanding of all the options out there.
How there are many ways to experience even the same kind of label identity, like that looks many different ways for many different people.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I identify like as queer, which is a very big umbrella term that a lot of people use. And because it's an umbrella term, there are just so many like different experiences. And it's important to realize that you can have your own. It doesn't have to be like everyone else's.
Yeah, great.
I'd also just like to point out, only tangentially related to the question, more just building off what Liliana just said, that experience you shared of, finding things that related to your friends' identities, but you didn't think they did to yours at the time, and being like, oh, this is cute, I should send it to them, is a really sweet way of like showing your support and your understanding your care for a person. Because you're saying that, hey, even though this isn't something that is true for me, like I am looking for ways to relate it to you and looking for ways to show that I care about and love you and that this is like a part of you that I know is there. So I just wanted to point out that.
Yeah, thank you. When we think about how we show love to people outside of this context, oh, you talked about that you had a test on Wednesday. How did it go? Like it's that sort of, normalizing kind of thing. It's just another part of who someone is. Is that what you're getting at? Great. Yeah. All right. Oh, Rachel, you have something?
I just wanted to add that when my child was exploring their gender identity and it came as a total surprise to me, and I wanted to be supportive, but as a cisgender heterosexual person, I didn't really know what to do. And so I found a support group on Facebook for parents of gender diverse kids. And that was such a lifeline for me. Parents who had been parenting gender diverse kids for a long time, kids of different ages. And then we had some meetups in real life. And those people were just a huge resource to me. So of course there's a dark side of the internet, but I found it to be such a supportive community, and such a huge, they were able to recommend doctors and therapists. And when my kid said, I'm the only transgender kid in my school, I said, let's find you some friends. Let's find you some trans friends. And so we did through this support group. So I just, and I've learned a lot too from trans influencers on Instagram, like Skylar Baylor, like Rebecca Brucehoff, who are young people who do a wonderful job of educating cisgender heterosexual people like me. So I think that there's a lot of good resources out there too.
Thank you. This question is a little bit to the just over topic wise, but it was asked a lot in the registration. We want to make sure that we get to it as well. Is how can primary care providers or like other kind of medical providers support their LGBTQ patients?
One thing that's been really helpful for me personally is, as I got older, probably into late middle school, my doctor, when she started asking questions that related to identity, or just kind of started bringing it up in general, would first have my parents leave the room. Not to say that my parents weren't supportive, but I just wasn't at a point where I was ready to talk about that yet. Um, and that really helped me, especially because I am type 1 diabetic. So I see an endocrinologist very often, and they would have you do all these sorts of like depression screenings and screenings like that, and kind of just try to get to know you a lot as a person. And it really helped me to be able to say, I'm comfortable here, I'm safe here, I'm able to share who I am here, even if I'm not in other places yet.
Anyone else like to add to the kind of how can doctors and medical professionals support you and your identity? I can also add that, what that action of having the parent leave the room or parents leaving the room kind of points to a larger point that oftentimes, if I'm not ready to share my identity with someone, it's very rarely because I don't trust them or don't like them as a person. There are a lot of other dynamics that play into who you share your identity with and who you don't. And most of the time, it has less to do with our ego than we think. And so learning to not take that personally, if a young person in your life who you're quite close to has shared their identity with other people first, or isn't coming to you with these questions, very often that doesn't have much to do with, an ego bruise. There are lots of factors that play into that. And so being aware of that and being accepting of that can be helpful. All right. Our next question. As the holidays approach, how can a parent who has a child in the LGBTQ plus community, but whose other family members don't understand or get it, how do you manage that as the family's getting together? Do you manage it before the gathering, on the spot? How does that best play out?
Talk to your kid. Have a conversation with them. Sit them down and say, hey, your Aunt Cindy's coming. She's very conservative. She's not going to be okay with like trans people if you recently transitioned or something like that. Sit them down, have an open conversation with them about why you think it might not be safe or why you think it might not be a good idea to talk about it at the gathering, and hear their perspective. Because maybe you have a child who really wants to come out to their family, and then, find a way to productively do that. But be open about it. Have an open discussion. It'll create a much safer and more comfortable environment once the actual event happens.
I completely agree. I think having a conversation beforehand is very helpful because it also gives like your child an outlet if they need it. I think some of these situations can be very stressful, and they don't necessarily have to be, as long as you have that conversation and make sure that, if your child at any point is uncomfortable, that they have some type of way to have an outlet in those type of spaces.
I think this can be very fraught and very difficult for everybody involved. I do think it's important to check with your child and talk about boundaries, right? How do you want to be called? what questions are you okay with? And as I would say, as a parent, as much as you can, kind of set those boundaries with family members ahead of time, right? If your child is okay with you sharing something about their identity, and then you say, these are the questions that I'm willing to answer, or these are the things that are okay to talk about. But I always told my kid, you be you and let me answer questions, right? Because he was very young. And I think now he's more comfortable advocating for himself, but I think having those questions ahead of time and setting boundaries as much as you can to protect your child is really important.
Yeah. And this is related. How can you handle it when people continue to use the wrong pronouns after you have given the ones that you'd prefer to be called by? How do you handle that situation? Or that a person has expressed that they want to be called by, whether it's your own pronouns or another person's pronouns whom you're parent of, mentor of, etc.
I think I can answer this. I first, of course, to sympathize, even for me, sometimes it's hard to have to memorize or to use someone's pronouns. It's kind of you have to get used to it. It's like everything else. And so I think that everyone understands that it is a process that you have to get used to. So, but also you can, correct yourself. I know I use she, they pronouns, and people tend to sometimes just stick with the she, her and forget about the they part. But I also have a lot of people who might start with she and then be like they, and just kind of just correct it. And, that is also fine. I think that, again, like I said, it is a process of getting used to, but just knowing that effort is there means a lot. And just correcting yourself. I think sometimes, for me at least, I feel better when someone doesn't make it such a big deal, oh my God, I'm so sorry I said that, but just, quickly correct it and move on. And I can see that person is making that effort to use the pronouns that I like to be called.
There's a lot of nuance to this question because it depends on, who's misgendering you. Or are you the person being misgendered, or are you seeing someone else be misgendered? A lot of stuff like that. But generally, I would say the first thing to do is, if you're comfortable, correct the person. And if it continues to happen to an extent that you are uncomfortable or feel that you cannot really comfortably be in this situation, remove yourself from it. Whether that entails switching out of a teacher's class, whether that entails, maybe not talking to one of your friends as much, or someone else that you used to be close to before you came out, getting away from the person that is doing it can be a really helpful, although a very difficult thing to do. Sometimes it feels like it's rude or mean to do to the person, but it's not. It's self-care. And there's nothing wrong with that.
One thing that I can add, so I have a lot of friends that use they, them pronouns, and one of them is my best friend for years, and my parents knew them since before they used those pronouns, and even though it has been 3 years since they started using they, them pronouns, my parents still can't use them. And I get that it's really hard, but it's also hard for us as youth as well. And I think that adults don't acknowledge that sometimes. They're it's so easy for you, but it's so hard for me. I have to learn how to do all these new things. And it's we grew up with the same vocabulary that you did. You are the ones who taught us language. It's just all about being willing to put in the work. And one thing that I think adults especially kind of fault on sometimes is you have to use people's correct pronouns even when you are not with them. I find that, like, especially with just my parents and other people's parents and just different adults, they'll like do their best to like use and correct pronouns when they're talking to that person, but then they'll be talking to me and they just don't put any effort into using the right pronouns or correcting themselves. And I know it might seem unimportant, but by doing that, you're really just disregarding that person's identity. And it does have a big impact. And it's kind of just, you can't just switch your like habits. You have to switch your mindset as well.
And you're missing out on an opportunity to practice. It just practice. And it's awkward. And I think just, we talk about they, them, if we don't know someone's gender, right? We use it all the time for a singular person, but we just have to get over ourselves and practice it. And I think what Cedar was saying is really important. It matters if there's an intention to do the right thing and just, you're making an error and you're not in the habit versus someone who's intentionally misgendering you. I think that those are really different circumstances. But if you're trying to, someone's changed pronouns and you're trying to get it right, just practice. Practice when you're not around them. And then it's easier.
Yeah. And with that, kind of consistency is the key here, right? In that, kind of respecting that person's identity when they're not in the room as well as when they're in the room. But also that consistency is a signal to other people who might not be out in their identity or not be exploring their identity yet, that if they ever do explore their identity or if they ever come out, that they're safe to do so. And that you're going to be a supportive person, kind of regardless of whether they're putting on a show to make you happy when you're in the room versus talking about you when you're out of the room and not making that same effort or priority. So it's also part of that creating a kind of specific, like, I'm a person you can come to, regardless of what your identity is or isn't. And showing that in how you treat someone who might have figured it out before you.
I do want to say one thing though about the pronouns, from just experience with some of my friends. Like, I know that sometimes, even with me, like I feel comfortable using maybe, I do have a set of pronouns I prefer, but sometimes there are some spaces where I'd rather not have those pronouns used for the sake of maybe not outing myself in certain situations that I don't feel safe enough to do so. So I think also a part of it is also knowing when, let's say it's a friend or a child, like what pronouns they want to use in certain situations, always making sure that they feel safe with the pronouns you're using, depending who you are talking to. Because there is a danger sometimes when it comes to outing somebody, if you don't ask those questions, like, do you feel comfortable with me using these pronouns for everyone? Or would you rather prefer me use this, maybe not in the classroom, but outside we can use your pronouns. So yeah.
Such a good point. Thank you, Daniela.
Yep. And it can be sometimes hard to remember, like having those conversations, like, every new situation. So also taking your cues from the person, watching what other people are calling them in that room and emulating that. And then you can talk about it after if you weren't sure, or like have that conversation, but always taking a cue from what the person you're trying to support is doing. Because in the end, it's their prerogative in that situation. All right. Next question. Okay. Several of you all on the panel have mentioned things sometimes not being safe. What does that mean?
For me, when I say that a situation is unsafe, generally I either mean that if I were to come out, I would feel physically unsafe, in that like I would feel as if my like physical well-being could be threatened if someone knew that I was queer. Maybe if you like grow up in the South, I spend a good amount of time in rural Virginia, and when I'm there, I often make an effort to not present or like look as queer as I do in other times. um, but it can also mean social well-being. Sometimes it can mean, if I talk about being queer here, are people going to look at me weird, and are people going to talk about me behind my back? So when I say it, it's a reference to just kind of like any level of discomfort or insecurity in a situation, and that can come from a number of things.
I completely agree with Cedar when I say like I feel unsafe. It's exactly the same exact thing. It's either it being physically feeling unsafe or just uncomfortable to the point where, maybe like sometimes the way that I think about it, especially in the classroom, is like if I feel unsafe to the point where I can't focus, like I just want to get out of that classroom. If I have those thoughts, that's when I know that I feel unsafe.
All right. And our next question kind of flows from this is how to support someone in the LGBTQ community who's experiencing bullying, and what measures we can take to keep LGBTQ students and youth safe from bullying experiences.
Well, on the preventative side, the best thing to do, in my opinion, to prevent like the high levels of like anti-LGBT bullying that are pretty commonly observed today, is to teach kids from a really young age that like it's okay to be different, it's okay to be queer, it's okay to like not be the same as other people, which of course is talked about in some respects. But if in when kids in 5th grade have to take family life, if they had a day to say some people, feel different about their gender, some people feel different about their sexuality, and that's okay, that's normal, to present it as a normal thing, as an okay thing, is the best way to stop people from ostracizing it when they get older.
Yeah, there's this book that it's like a children's book that I had as a kid. And it's called There's No Such Thing as a Dragon. And basically the dragon like appears in the house one day. There's this little dragon, and the kid is like, hey, look, there's a dragon here. And the parents are like, oh, dragons don't exist. Like, what dragon? And then the dragon gets bigger and bigger and bigger over the course of the day until the dragon is like carrying the whole house on its back. And then the book ends when they pet the dragon on the head, and then it just like gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and this really like nice little pet at the end. So that's what that made me think of, that things that are mysterious or things that we kind of, hide behind curtains and whatnot, become a lot easier to kind of make into things that, ostracize people and things like that. So that's what I thought of when you said kind of talking about it from a young age. It's not a dragon, it's a nice pet. It's a normal thing.
And I think a lot of spaces have anti-bullying policies in place, right? So finding out what those policies are and what rights you have and what how to deal with that, who has the power to intervene and make it stop. I would say if your faith community hasn't talked about bullying too, this is, something that should be discussed in outside of schools, right? It's very prevalent in schools, the education around bullying, but I think a lot of other spaces, when we talk about creating safe space, let's just assume it's not going to happen here, because we're all nice people and that's not how we act. But having some norms and expectations around how we treat everybody, and what happens when there is a pattern of bullying, how do we address it? How do we make it stop? I totally agree with what Cedar said about just normalizing diversity from the outset. Helps to create a culture of acceptance and welcome, but we're unfortunately not there yet in every space, which is why we're having this panel. So.
All right. Well, I'm going to pose one final question to all of you, and hopefully each of you can get a few words in on this one. If there is one action you hope that people watching this, people in the audience today will take, based on the discussion we've had, what would that be?
I'll just jump in. So it's Transgender Awareness Week this week. So there's tons of information right now about transgender identity and experience. And I would just say, please do some reading, listen to a book, listen to a podcast, read an article about what it's like to be transgender, especially a transgender youth. There's a tremendous amount of legislation all across the country attacking our transgender youth, trying to take away their rights to just be kids and to play sports and to have access to gender affirming care. And so just if you are not familiar with the transgender experience, just take this week to learn something about it and practice some empathy for what it's like to not fit into the gender binary, and to live and be your full self in a world that doesn't always affirm or welcome or accept that.
Thanks, Rachel. And Jen has put in the chat as well a webpage from GLAAD about Trans Week, so you can check that out too.
I'd like to echo the importance of empathy and the importance of going out and trying to learn with an open mind, because there is nothing that's going to help you more and your child or whoever you're here to support more than the knowledge that you are putting in your best effort to support them and understand them and, meet them in the middle, as it were. And, coming out is a journey, and it fields a lot of uncomfortable questions, can create a lot of uncomfortable situations. So understand that. Try to look at it from a perspective outside of your own and realize that it's a difficult situation for everyone. And because of that, you should do your best to be understanding and open and empathetic and learn as much as you can.
Right. And to add on to that, I just want to say, also with that open mind, don't feel the pressure to get everything right at the first time. Everything is going to be a learning experience, and just joining this panel shows that you have that, motivation to learn and to listen. And that's just where to start, to learn and to listen. And, understand that this, like Cedar said, is a process for everybody. It's a way, it's, a process of learning. I'm still learning. And, to not be afraid or to turn away because you think you can't get it right. Because, like I said, it's a learning experience. And as long as, just being on this panel is the first step of listening and learning.
For me, I think that what like you need to do is, whether you're a parent or an educator, is reach out to the youth in your life, because it's just really important that you put the work in to make sure that they feel supported and know that you're a safe space for them. If they need to talk, or if they just, or if they have like, or if they change their identity or how they express themselves, that you are someone that they feel comfortable being around, because it just makes such a difference having someone in your life that you know you can always go to. So just being proactive, putting the work in, even if you think it might seem pointless, it's not. So that is what I would recommend.
Great. Yeah, and I'll just add on my piece that, kind of expressing active interest. I think there's this idea that young people don't want to hear from adults, that like young people are their own like insulated thing and they don't want to have conversations with adults, but in reality, like most do. Like showing that active interest will then create sort of a reciprocal relationship in which, a young person will come to you because you also come to them. So not being afraid to do that approach, not being afraid to be the first one to reach out or to kind of like text first, and moving forward with that, and also echoing what Daniela said in not holding ourselves to a standard of perfection. Nobody's perfect in interacting with people and supporting people in a very kind of large scale sense as well. So that was our last question. And honestly, I want to say thank you so much to our 4 panelists who have come and answered questions for us today. Thank you for sharing your perspective, for taking each question. And just so that you all are aware as well, after this event, we will be sending out a resource list specific for LGBTQ plus youth. So that's for all registered attendees. So if you registered for this event, please stay on the lookout for that. And you can visit everymind.org, every-mind.org, to find out more information about what we're doing here, and also to contact us if you like. So yeah, from there, webinars are funky, so they just kind of end. So adjourn and go enjoy the rest of your evening, and thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Sophia, for your wonderful facilitation.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.